So just to set the scene for this this discussion, and it will sort of feed on nicely from the opening panel discussion we had today around globalization in the age of populism and crises. So we're looking at whether sort of geopolitical tensions and events like the pandemic, and more recently some of the events that are affecting shipping lanes, like the attacks in the Red Sea, are disrupting established trade routes and causing delays and exposing supply chain vulnerabilities. Now, what we want to know from this session is how well do bosses know their own supply chains, and what are their points of exposure if different geopolitical or physically disastrous situations happen? What are the best practices for building robust crisis plans, and how can data and analytics be leveraged to increase agility? So to get started today, I'd like to put this question to all of you, and I might start with you, Alan. Given how much uncertainty businesses have seen over the last 5 years and the impact it has had on trade and supply chains, do you think businesses are better at managing it now? Like, we've obviously seen a lot happen post-COVID, but the age of uncertainty is upon us. How and why do you think that businesses are or are not coping with it better?
Thanks, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. So COVID taught us a lesson. I mean, the world shut down. But in the wake of COVID, following COVID, we've all sort of sat back and we've relaxed. But the issues are not stopping. If I just look at the East African region or the African region where I work, in the last few months, we've had severe climate shocks. In Kenya, floods disrupting everything. We've had Marburg, we've had Mpox, we've had the Houthi rebels. One thing that I've found consistent, we don't have the right data to predict. So we are not doing it right. We are very reactive. When Mpox came up, we set up another committee for safe trade because I work on trade. And then I kept recognizing, now Marburg has come. In the last week, they've announced Marburg. Again, it's going to impact trade most likely because the vectors are often truck drivers and transporters. So one of the things we are not doing well is being predictive. But one of the things we have started doing in our company is really looking at data, especially climate data, as we construct, say, markets or bridges or roads. And we're trying to do that using big data, but also predictive data in terms of what are the weather patterns going to be like 10, 15 years? How harsh is the sun going to be? How strong is the rains going to be? And that, I think, is making us much stronger and more resilient, because then we're able to build buildings that can withstand those shocks. Whereas before, we were not building for the shocks. As a result, we've lost a lot of money, millions of dollars, that were not predicted because we hadn't done the prediction.
I mean, I'll come back to this more broadly towards the end of our discussion, I think, but I'm interested to know, are you sort of using big data in relation to other types of risks? I mean, we're seeing the slowdown of the Chinese economy. We've seen this ongoing sort of geopolitical tensions and conflicts around the world. I mean, what else are you using big data for?
I think for me, as in the position I sit, it's allowing me to take decisions on what to invest in, where to put our money, where to do work. Let me give an example. We're working with the government of Djibouti, where we've been looking at the Houthi rebels have been in effect for the last year or two. And we've seen shipping lines disrupted, supply chains disrupted, but no one had done that analysis with the government itself. We've had a lot of outward analysis. So what we're now doing is working with this data with the government and saying, this is how it's impacting your economy. And everyone has sat up and said, oh my goodness, we have to do something about this. So I think that's something we're trying to do better. Look at the data that's out there, but also work with the actual owners of this data, users of this data, to make it useful.
Great, thank you. And Raja, can I revert back to the original question for you? Do you think that businesses, organizations are better prepared post-COVID in sort of this age of uncertainty? Are the supply chains more resilient? What are your thoughts?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. Obviously, I think, as we all have seen how COVID has digitized the world, whether we liked it or not, and we started to look at alternatives to manage our businesses. And that created the opportunity for big data to really serve its purpose. AI is a trend now, and it's affecting the whole economy across multiple sectors. And AI feeds on big data. And the more we can capture this data to make use of it, the more we will be able to advance and be prepared for the future. With regards to managing or mitigating risks, that's what we do at ECI. We take care of all of our exporters, not to worry about, political risks or any risks that might affect their supply chain or their transactions. And that's where we leverage on data sources to be able to predict where these risks will have the biggest impact. How can we protect our customers in those markets? But definitely, we have developed an internal solution at ECI that feeds off multiple data sources and give us information of more than 300 million records of companies around the world, buyers, that we can tell you from today that this would be a good transaction or not, and how risky this market or this sector for you. So I think the data is available at this stage. I think there is a huge opportunity to shape it into a more meaningful source for us to take better decisions within our businesses. Yes, we're accessing those data and we're taking those decisions, but I think we are at the very beginning of the capability or potential of this data to drive business forward.
Just on that, do you think that we're at the point where we can sort of fully trust the data sets that we're seeing? I mean, there are cyber threats around the world. We know that they're sort of developing your own model in terms of sort of generative AI can be quite expensive. I mean, are you at the point where you have the confidence to put that much trust?
I don't think we're confident yet, because also it's the beginning of shaping these kind of technologies and data sources. And this is where you see countries like the UAE, for example, who has a national AI strategy that will govern the use of the data, the execution of the data, and the impact of the data. And that's very important for us to start building that confidence into these data sources or data sets, because if they're not structured in the right way and not governed in the right way, they won't be able to give us the information that we would like to work with. So I think it's a bit early on the trust side.
A little bit to go still. Thank you very much. And Rachel, I'll put the same question to you. And obviously you're coming at it from a very unique perspective, sort of from the procurement function. I've just come from a roundtable specifically focused on procurement and sort of how you retain the skills that are needed for procurement to continue to be successful into the future. So keen to understand from your perspective, you're very close to supply chains. How do you think businesses are managing the uncertainty that we live within now?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I mean, so my background is I've had the privilege of working with 16 organisations and a similar number of industries as well. And recently just coming from Rolls-Royce, so aerospace, and before that, Lightsource BP, so that was utility scale solar development. And just before that, Chief Procurement Officer at Johnson Matthey, so that's a catalytic technology organisation. And honestly, the devil's in the detail. So we'll come on to a whole lot of different risk mitigation strategies later, I'm sure. But the reality is, to me, is that companies are just waking up to how bad is it, the reality of actually what their organizations are dealing with their supply chains. Many organizations barely understand their tier 1 suppliers, let alone tier 2 or tier N, as increasing regulation is demanding for us to know. And many organizations are grappling with the data sets that they've actually got available within their organizations. So there are some gaps. So even from a data point of view, I know we talk about AI, fabulous, and absolutely, I think there is real opportunity around that. And we look about the sort of external data sets that can facilitate our risk mitigation strategies. But a lot of organizations and the companies I mentioned are the same as any of them that you look at I've worked in. They're trying to really make sure that they've got those internal understanding of their supply chain. So I think we are at that awakening stage in many cases. I think if it's consumer facing as an industry, they tend to be a bit further ahead. So they do tend to understand more tiers of their supply chain, but not necessarily all of their suppliers, and also the interdependencies with other industries that might be drawing on their feedstocks of their suppliers.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, that is one of the key sort of risks that we should note here, and I'm sure we'll talk about it throughout the discussion, but regulation is changing. Greater transparency is going to be sort of a requirement for all organisations as we move forward, and data will be key to that. So Claudia, can I ask you the same question? And obviously you're coming in it from the perspective of an organisation that is facing a lot of these sort of regulations, which isn't sort of key to the question right now, but I think you have a very unique perspective on this also.
Thank you, Liz. Good morning, all. Yes, well, Ferrero is one of the world's largest sweet packaged food companies. And as such, we are, some of our products, just to name a few, are Nutella, Kinder, Ferrero Rocher. So as such, we are dealing with and we are operating with global, complex and diverse supply chains. Just to name a few, cocoa, hazelnut, palm oil, and dairy. So our approach to being resilient and to risk assessment starts with traceability. That goes back to what the colleagues just said about data gathering. So traceability really enables us to have a deep visibility and thus a deep understanding of our supply chains, understanding so the socioeconomic, environmental, agricultural elements that are characterizing each of these commodities. So such understanding will enable us to define our strategy, our procurement strategy, sustainability strategy, as well as our risk assessment strategy. Indeed, in a nutshell, our risk assessment strategy is based on 4 streams. The first one, which is the entry point, is of course supplier risk assessment and due diligence. All of our suppliers undergo a thorough risk assessment and due diligence process. The second stream is about supply chain visibility, not only for the reason that we were discussing, so data gathering, visibility, understanding, but also because that will enable us to measure, assess, and improve our practices, because we believe that this is, of course, a continuous improvement journey into the supply chains. The third stream is about the fact that we rely on certification and standards. So all our main ingredients follow strict sustainability standards. And for example, as of today, 90% of our main ingredients are sourced back to origin. And the fourth and very crucial point, we believe that is the one that is making a difference, is really the dedicated mitigation programs. That means that for those supply chains that bears higher risk, we develop together with trusted partners dedicated programs to tackle specific issues, systemic issues of each of these supply chains. And at the end, finally, we also perform auditing and verification activities. On average, we perform 1,500 audits on-site or remotely in order really to understand where we are, which is if our data are consistent, are truthful, if there is any element that we need to fix, if there is anything that we can gather from this verification process in order to understand what are the possible new upcoming risks in order to prevent them and get prepared at best.
So I think we'll dig into a little bit how some of these risk mitigation strategies might change between sectors and that sort of thing into the discussion a little bit later. But Lord Odni-Lister, I'd really like to hear from you as well on this, because I mean, being the sort of a co-chair of the UK UAE Business Council, you must be hearing a lot from business around this type of thing. And I mean, what are your members telling you?
Our members are most concerned about ease of doing business. That's the priority for them. How easy is it to do it? Is the language straightforward? Is the legal framework one they can understand and follow? Are the time zones right for them? And it's about their risk. How much risk are they taking? If they're locating a factory, a distribution center, whatever, wherever they're going, they need to understand all of that. Now, that's where, of course, Dubai comes into its own because of its ports, its airports, its communication links. It is the ideal center for trading into more difficult markets where perhaps you might not want to make those investments. It's an ideal center for the Indo-Pacific region. It's an ideal center for Africa. It's where you will trade through. And that's why there are some 14,000 British companies that actually export into the UAE, and there's some 5,000 British companies based here. So you can actually see how important this is as a hub for doing business. Could I just pick up the point about data? Because I think this is actually probably the nub of the issue for everybody. Everybody needs information. And the easier it is to transmit information, the better. That's why, for example, the UK government did a data transfer deal with Singapore, because it enabled them to open up data lines and share information in a way that perhaps wouldn't be possible without that kind of agreement in place. And that was a first. It's undoubtedly where one hopes things like a free trade agreement or a future CEPA or something else will go, will actually pick up this transfer of data issue. Because for companies, I mean, people claim it's the new oil. It is the new oil. It's what everybody needs. They need good, reliable data, and they need it secure.
Yeah, you've just touched on another really interesting point that I want to loop back to later, and it's around sort of government intervention and what they can be doing to help businesses manage and mitigate risk. But I want to just quickly back to Claudia, just to talk about different sort of how businesses are preparing for different kinds of risks. We know from sort of some of the research that we've done for our Trade in Transition program and our Procurement Imperative program that when it comes to supply chains, businesses are still very much favouring sort of a risk mitigation technique around diversification. I'm interested to know from you, I guess, from your business perspective, there are lots of different risks coming down the line. What kind of strategies are you employing to ensure that you're effectively managing them whilst also seeing sort of a path forward for growth?
Yes, thank you. So, as I said earlier, I mean, the approach is the one that I was describing according to those four streams. But it's true that for us, it's extremely important knowing exactly the risk related to each supply chain to develop tailored programs. So, for example, on palm oil, it's true we started 20 years ago, back in 2005, deciding, for example, to become members of RSPO, so the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. And already at that time, we decided to go for the segregated model. That means that we can trace back our palm oil up to plantations, and then we keep our palm oil separated, but whatever any other source palm oil. And that was already the first step to have the real visibility that we were sourcing from plantations, that they were not generating deforestation. As we know, palm oil, one of the core issues is deforestation. But we didn't stop there. So, for example, we kept on scouting, new technologies in order to gather, as we were all saying, reliable data. So, for example, we adopted the Starlink satellite monitoring system, which is a system developed by Earthworm Foundation and Airbus, based on satellite imagery and on the ground expertise, in order really to have in almost nearly real time information about land use change or forest disruption, so that we can get the information promptly and where needed, if necessary, to take action in order to prevent that deforestation occurs. Another example of a different kind of approach is on cocoa. So cocoa as well, especially recently, we are talking about this deforestation, but we are talking also about the fact that there are no available data about the size of the farms, where the farms are, etc. So because of that, we have got a polygon mapping system. So we trained people. So in this case, you see, we are training people exactly for that specific task. They go in the farms where we source cocoa from, and they connect the points of the GPS points in order to really define the size of the farm and to ensure that that farm is not in a protected forest area, for example. But also one of the systemic and very complex challenges of the cocoa supply chain, as we all know, is child labor. So in that case, that's the case where we developed a dedicated program together with Save the Children that we deploy in Côte d'Ivoire, which is one of our main sourcing countries. And that's where we work on the ground together with Save the Children to share good social practices. That means sharing with adults and with children the children's rights, because it seems obvious to all of us, but it's not obvious there in those communities. So we share this information, we empower them with this information, we share with them good agricultural practices in order for them to treat their cocoa production in a way to have a better yield, better in terms of quality and of quantity. We build up what we call the bridging school. So that means that we take children out of labor and we bring back them to school. We teach them the basic of, reading, writing, mathematics, in order to enable them to be then ready to step into the national educational system, because we are talking about children also of 10 years old, which have never been received any education. So for them, it would be impossible to step into the national educational system. So with these bridging classes, we can do that. We teach them also about how to get funds from the banks and how to manage that money. So we really work together with those communities in order to enable them, to empower them to be resilient and to be productive. These are just a couple of examples. Of course, we also deal with other kinds of situation. You were mentioning, Liz, the regulation. For sure, we are all dealing with the EUDR, the EU Deforestation Free Regulation, which is setting a set of criteria and principle, and we welcome that. It will be challenging to put it in place practically, but we welcome that because it enables a kind of a level playing ground field for all the players. And we are well equipped, I would say, but this is because, as I said, we started a long time ago. So meaning that the preparation of knowing the supply chains, assessing the risk, developing action plans to manage the risk is something that, I'm stating the obvious, doesn't come overnight. It's really a matter of continuous commitment and continuous improvement in order to achieve this kind of understanding, which is not an ending point. As I said, this is a continuous learning, a continuous process ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, did you have anything to add there?
No, as Claudia spoke, I thought about the element of risk, of trust, which Raja had raised and Claudia has talked about. In the olden days, there would have been a trusted system for you to know that this, what I'm getting is, is trusted. But unfortunately, we've had to put in place systems, certifications, and the like. But I wanted to take the trust back to the whole issue of these risks that we are dealing with, most of them being very transboundary in nature, and yet we see often governments being very reactive and trying to contain. And yet we know, for instance, with COVID and other airborne diseases, you're not going to be able to contain and you're not going to be able to keep it out. And so trust comes in very handy, and especially digital solutions that enhance transparency, openness, and trust. And I can just share one that we were able to develop around COVID and that we hope to use in other similar circumstances. When COVID happened, all governments in Africa and around the world closed their borders. But for landlocked countries whose very livelihoods depend on trade, you have no way of sustaining. Uganda, where I come from, or Rwanda, everything is imported from medicine to gloves to food in some cases. And so truck drivers were often seen as the vectors of these diseases, airborne diseases especially, became our biggest national issue in the region. And so one of the things we did quickly is to deploy a digital solution to track the drivers and especially the COVID certificates. This immediately brought back the trust within the governments, and the presidents were able to order the borders to reopen. And this is an award-winning kind of solution. Now, if we can deploy similar solutions in different scenarios where we can help governments and others who are taking decisions to have visibility, to trust that what you're getting is actually true, then we have hope. So I think we should invest much more in these kind of solutions.
Yeah, I mean, transfer of technologies is incredibly important, particularly between sort of developed and developing countries, and obviously sort of regional cooperation, international cooperation, very important. So, Rachel, just coming back to, I guess you mentioned that you've worked across a range of different sectors. The devil is in the detail. What can you tell us about how different sectors are approaching risk mitigation strategies?
Yeah, and to come back to that, the supply chain vulnerabilities that they're facing, we have to look through different lenses. So I'm going to be a bit broad before I go into the individual sectors, because these are different lenses that we need to be considering. So first of all, there's a big difference in terms of the opportunities, the levers you've got if you're in a regulated industry versus a non-regulated industry. If it's in a regulated industry, typically speaking, it takes longer. The switching cost, time, complexity is a lot higher. So you have to take that into consideration for sure. And that might have an effect as well in terms of those switching of supplies. So I'll just give you an example of that. So when I was working in Johnson Matthey, one of the exercises that we did, and this is that internal understanding your internal information to be able to do something on the external side of it, we mapped through one material specification from one supplier. So you can imagine we have tens of thousands of these specifications. We mapped that one material through to each of our production lines that product touched, each of the products that touched, each of the OEMs, so the car manufacturers that touched, and each of the geographies, and then into each of the car platforms. And that one material specification had more than 250 change points in a regulated industry. And each of those change points arguably could be up to £1 million to make the changes, just as a cost factor, let alone the technical resources that you actually need to do the science bit, the science and engineering. So quite often, the ability to change is almost like cost prohibitive, resource prohibitive. So this is where, as organizations, we need to really be thinking about existing products versus new product introduction. The best thing we can ever do, and this is my pitch as a procurement and supply chain person, is to get your procurement and supply chain people involved at the earliest R&D stage, new product introduction stage, so that you're actually designing in flexibility from the outset. So many organizations that I go into, quite often we're sole sourced. We're not even single source. Sole source means that we've designed that product around one material from one particular supplier. So rather than it being a performance-based specification, it's a functional one. So these are the things, the best thing that we can do, hopefully you take that away, is that you actually, from the outset, we're designing with this supply chain risk management, as well as cost commercial agility. We're designing that in. The other factors that we think about as well is really around the degree of unpredictability about consumer demand. So when we think about that from a retail sector point of view, that fluctuation is really a challenge quite often. They're faced with all sorts of logistical challenges, port delays, those sorts of things. So real-time data analytics is an important mitigation strategy for them. I think the other thing we need to think about, and you touched on it actually, whilst I'm talking at an industry level within an organisation, we do need to think about that segmentation by, we would call it categories of spend. Because, some of those categories of spend have got a high degree of supply scarcity. So whether we were talking about cobalt, nickel, even copper, obviously that's coming elsewhere, versus that supply abundance, you're going to have a different approach to that. So I guess an example there would be in the pharmaceutical industry with active pharmaceutical ingredients. One of the mitigation strategies that many organizations are dealing with is laying down security stock. So they're stockpiling where they can to mitigate that if they don't have that opportunity, or it takes a long time to be able to find to dual source, for example. Mm. I think the other thing to think about as well is the product life cycle of your industries. So if you're in a normal life cycle, you've probably got more chance to flex. But if you're in an incredibly short time frame life cycle, so that would be typically in the technology industries. Certainly when I was at Lightsource BP in the solar development sector, The photovoltaic, so the modules, the solar panels, the technology is evolving every 9 months. So, you're not going to put down large amounts of stock in those because ultimately, it's a margin sum game. You're trying to make them more and more efficient, and that's really what's driving the innovation. So thinking about, what is that product life cycle that you're dealing with will have a bearing as well in terms of what you're dealing with. So that gives you a bit of a flavour in terms of the different lenses that you need to look through. But, what are those risk mitigation strategies? We've talked about a few. The first one I will always talk about is supplier relationship management. I mean, too often we see our suppliers just as commodities. And I know there are commodities, but ultimately you're only as good as the relationship you've got with your key suppliers. So supplier relationship management is an absolute key one for us. We've talked about strategic stockpiling. We have talked about diversification. You hear that a lot. You're going to hear it everywhere. But as I say, the devil is in the detail of that, because it's not always, it might not be an opportunity because there might not be a supply out there to go to, and you'll have to do innovation through your strategic relationship management, building out alternative supply, creating new supply routes that way. All the things we've heard about this morning, whether it's dual or multi-sourcing, that whole regionalization. So I call it globalization. It's that move from, a global supply chain to that global local. It's very dependent. I know that the car manufacturers, we hear about it, that they are reshoring, nearshoring. I mean, their manufacturing typically has kind of worked around that anyway. Certainly when I was at Johnson Matthey, we were further up the food chain. So we were sort of 2 parts removed from the car manufacturer. So we're in part of our products was the catalytic converter. It was the brick that would scrub the NOx out of the air. So we're sort of two stages up. But, we were already part of this just in time. Our manufacturing facilities were mirroring the footprint of our customers anyway. So it's more about the nearshoring, reshoring is actually up the supply chains and really understanding those input materials and where do they actually need to be, for all of the reasons the panels have actually, the panelists here have spoken about. So that's a key part of it. And then I'm sure we'll come to talk about technologies and AI, because there's a huge wealth of opportunities for us really around getting that predictability, that scenario planning, etc., in our supply chains.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will come back to that point on technology. But Raja, I want to just quickly wind back to diversification. And I mean, the UAE is a great example of how we're seeing, a diversification of exports. I wonder if you could just talk us through how that is working as sort of a risk mitigation technique.
So ECI was actually set up as one of the diversification tools of the economy as an export credit agency that supports exports from the UAE, everything except for oil and gas. And that really have been, working really well, because to date we have more than 10 billion dirhams exposure in more than 110 countries around the world. And that's covering UAE exports and re-exports from the UAE to 110 countries. So we take an active role in connecting with our counterparts in all over the world to identify potential trade and investment opportunities for UAE companies, where we facilitate those trade transactions, secure these trade transactions through our insurance policies, and also enable those companies to tap into these opportunities to grow and scale from the UAE. And also, we cannot ignore the fact that the UAE has been working actively on enabling CEPA agreements that are negotiating those trade barriers for UAE companies to enable the UAE companies tap into these markets. And we've seen a very positive results that is translated in the 3.5 trillion dirhams of trade that has gone out from the UAE in this particular year. And what we have realized is that creates a value proposition for global companies to come and set up in the UAE to benefit from the regulatory setup, from CEPA agreements, from negotiated trade barriers, from trade credit insurance solutions that would enable those companies to grow and scale. So we see a kind of connected ecosystem in the UAE that is attractive to companies to set up, to tap into these opportunities without being, trapped into thinking about all of the risks, because there are companies that really take care of risks for exporters and manufacturers to benefit from these opportunities that are there. As I mentioned, with regards to risks, there are different global views on these risks, and for trade in particular, it is really much tied into, the geopolitical scene that's really shaping these transactions. And as the UAE has this, I would say, progressive relationships, we are able to mitigate those kind of risks and advocate for our companies by leveraging on the international relationships and foreign trade relations that we have with a lot of these countries. And we continue to focus on growing our global trade footprints for UAE companies at different levels, whether it's large corporates that we are able to take, to a global scale, or it's our SMEs that we are encouraging to tap into international markets. Obviously, the first transaction is always the most critical one for these companies, because it's their first experiment with an international trade body, international trade transaction that is exposed to global risks. However, being supported by an export credit agency of any country really makes it easier for these companies. And on that note, I just want to mention that we've launched our Export Exponential program, where we are taking a few of UAE companies to global markets on the first time and support them throughout that first simulation of international transaction. And we're hoping to increase the number of UAE-based companies that are interested in global trade and support them through all of the risks associated with those transactions.
Yeah, it sounds as though the relationship between the public and private sector is really critical to helping sort of manage these risks. And so, Lord Adney Lister, I will come to you on this, because, I mean, the UK has seen a huge period of expansion post sort of Brexit and embarking on the new independent trade policy program that they have. What Raja just said, does that sort of align with what you're hearing in the market as well around, I guess, the critical role that government plays in supporting businesses to expand into new regions, to new markets?
Absolutely, and the whole issue of export credits is so important, because it's about risk mitigation. In fact, I was at the head office of a firm in Sharjah only yesterday at BIA, where UK government had actually given credit insurance for some 30-odd million for a new building, which was built there. Now, that building probably wouldn't have been built without that kind of credit insurance, because businesses need certainty, and this is what government can give. They can mitigate risks. They can mitigate the political risks. They can mitigate the economic risks to a large extent, so that people can have more confidence in going into new markets, perhaps difficult markets. And without government support, that's just not going to be possible. And back to your first point about Brexit, the UK left the European Union. In leaving the European Union, it left a structure, an organisation that business understood, and was very Europe-focused. And now, of course, it's had to be, the focus has had to change. That's why so much effort has gone in and is going into a free trade agreement with the GCC, why they have joined the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, why new trade agreements have been set up with Canada or Australia and so on. These things, you've got to, the world's a big place, and you've got to go to all these markets. Yes, the UK has lost a market, or it's made a particular market more difficult for itself, but it has opened up other markets. And business need to transition between those things. And without some kind of government help and support, they're just not going to be doing it. And the great thing about agreements, whether they be CEPAs, free trade agreements, they create frameworks for companies to work within. And everybody needs some kind of framework. They need to understand what they're getting into. And then, as you've just heard, to get some kind of credit insurance on the back of that just makes it all possible.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into that a little bit more, but we are sort of drawing to a close of the session. So I want to open up to questions from the crowd, just to see if there's anything that anyone is curious about to dig in with our sort of specific people up here. Please raise your hand, and if you do have a question, we'll sort of get a mic across to you. If not, I have more questions to get into. But do feel free to raise your hand and I'll keep an eye on the audience if anything crops up in the meantime. So Alan, I wanted to talk to you as well a little bit about sort of the differences in terms of managing these types of risks across regions. We've just heard from Raja and from Lord Udny Lister around some of the importance of, I guess, putting, diversifying and giving businesses more certainty and options. I mean, from the Africa lens, how does it differ, do you think, in comparison to different regions around the world?
I mean, African companies are just not ready. Yesterday, I was sitting with a finance minister from one of the larger countries in Africa. And for 2 hours, we talked about regulation can also be a risk. So for instance, the EU deforestation rules and the impact they're having on key sectors like coffee. This country depends on coffee exports. It's its largest export. And within the next few months, unless there's an extension, they are unable to meet the requirements in the EU. So they cannot export. And you can imagine what that means for millions of farmers that are depending on coffee. So I think for me, the key issue as we talk about diversification and all, even European companies are complaining they cannot meet these requirements. So let alone African companies. Two things come through and they have been spoken about. The capacities, so analytical skills, the right data, trusted data, but also the costs, the huge costs involved. You can imagine for this country, turning around its farmers to ensure that you can certify all this coffee, to ensure that you're not using, cutting down protected forests. It's going to take a lot of money. And this is where real partnerships come in. Perhaps as the UAE looks at investing out, looking into some of these sectors that require real financing and partnerships to actually make them robust and resilient. I think it's a big, big challenge for governments in Africa, let alone the small businesses that really, African trade depends a lot on small business, small and medium business. So
yeah, I mean,
new insurance types, new types of partnerships that are going to help these companies and the governments become resilient.
Yeah, I was just going to say that some of these regulations that are coming in, and particularly in reference to sort of some of the environmentally friendly ones from the EU, some of the consequences are, and Claudia, I'm sure you know a little bit about this as well, are that they exclude SMEs to a degree and they exclude them from global value chains because they can't sort of meet the requirements. So what are your views in terms of how government and the private sector can work together to navigate that a little bit better? And Claudia, I know we touched a little bit on this last year in the conversation that we had, but I'd be interested to hear from your perspective what more, I guess, the public and private sectors could be doing to collaborate on this.
I think what we're trying to do is show up businesses. So if you look at the profile of who is exporting, if right now I live in Kenya, and if you look at who is exporting horticulture produce to the EU that needs to meet, say, the packaging requirements of the EU, it's women, small businesses. They export once, twice, then they fall out because they can't meet the regulations or they can't meet the requirements or they can't finance. And so we are looking at a different suite of things. Financing is critical, capacities are critical, but also working with governments to ensure that if you cannot meet the quality right now for, say, packaging, how do you ensure that you do not tax out those that are either coming to invest? So if the UAE is coming to invest, you're not taxing them at 100% to invest and build up the capacity of that sector to meet the requirements. So it's a whole suite of things. You can't just do one thing because you're not going to be able to meet to address all the challenges. But SMEs, who are the bedrock of Africa's export, we definitely need to have clear solutions. One of the organizations we've set up, it's called Trade Catalyst Africa, is looking at new financing solutions for for SMEs, especially where the NPA is quite high and no one is going to lend to you because you cannot meet the threshold. So we're looking at behavior, we're using data again to trace and track and see who can you trust to actually provide these facilities so they're able to overcome these shocks, they're able to be resilient and they're able to sustain their export systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that leads quite nicely on to my last question, and we do have a very short period of time, so very quick answers from everyone on this. So technology is going to play a really key role in the future. I mean, the future is now. Technology is here. We're still waiting for sort of trade rules and regulation to catch up, and there's a whole stream that will cover this later on. But I'm keen to know, we've talked about big data. What are the key sort of technology, emerging tech areas that you think are going to help with risk mitigation moving forward? I'll start with you, Lord Adney Lister, and then we'll sort of move down the line.
I think the first thing is it's about the security of data, and I think the UAE is doing exactly the right thing of saying it wants to be a data hub. It's embracing AI, and that is what people need to hear because that's where the future lies, and that's where business needs to go. And it's always worth remembering that for business, ease of doing business is if you can do it electronically. You don't want bits of paper, and so. This is the right place for that.
Claudia?
Well, I would be repeating the same. I mean, really, it's the crucial role of data, of reliable data, data that you can verify, that can give you the information that you can rely on to define your own strategy and your own action plans. That is really a crucial element.
Thank you. Rachel?
I think there's some really exciting things happening now with blockchain. I think blockchain is finding its place. We all want to sort of share information, and I think that is that opportunity between public and private sector, but we have to recognize there's parts of the world that will not share their information. Yeah. So there is blockchain technologies with clean rooms in between, so you can query it, but you don't necessarily see and have access to the data. So I think that's going to be a really powerful thing to unlock full traceability, transparency back to source.
Thank you. Raja?
I believe technology has already proved that it works, and the main challenge that we have is really adoption at the highest levels. And I think changing the mindset of organizations and people and being open to trust and to use and to experiment with technology will be a key driver in advancing these technologies and enabling adoption and also access to these technologies. Because as long as we are doubting and resenting and trying to get away with other ways, we will never play a role in advancing this. But really taking things on, doing proofs of concepts, connecting with other ecosystem players, and being open to experiment, fail, experiment, and succeed, I think will enable the technology to advance our industry.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think big data exists. There's a lot out there, but we don't have the capacities to analyze it. And if I just look at, for instance, weather, that's a good place to start for Africa that's being buffeted by a lot of climate shocks. If we can just get those capacities going to analyze existing weather patterns over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, then it will help us make better choices and better decisions, especially as we construct. And I know many in the UAE, for instance, have already done this, but we need to do this better on the continent. So capacities to analyze already existing data.
Well, some interesting thoughts to leave you all with today. I want to thank our panelists for joining for the discussion and for you for joining and listening today. But that concludes our session, and I'll hand back to John Ferguson. Thank you.
Thank you.